the food safety coordinator at our state fair, announced over the loudspeakers that she'd just poisoned 30,000 people with hallucinogens mixed into the funnel cakes and lemonade because her daughter died from food poisoning 5 years ago, and she wanted everyone to experience chemical truth. While my sister started convulsing from the corn dog she'd eaten, but then the same woman who poisoned us gave me red pills that saved my sister's life before calmly taking notes on her victims like we were lab rats in her twisted experiment. I was halfway through my pretzel at the state fair when the loudspeakers started screeching with feedback before the fair director's voice came through. But instead of announcing the pie contest winners, his tone was pure dread. Ladies and gentlemen, I need your immediate attention. We have just received notification from the health department that needs everyone to stop eating or drinking anything purchased at this fair immediately. Put down whatever is in your hands right now. My sister dropped her corn dog mid-bite while the family next to us froze with cotton candy halfway to their mouths, and all around me thousands of people stood paralyzed holding half-eaten food. The director explained that multiple food vendors had been contaminated with a substance intentionally introduced into our supply chain that morning, and symptoms would begin appearing within the next hour, so everyone who had consumed any food or beverage needed to proceed immediately to the medical tents being set up in the parking lot. The crowd exploded into panic as parents grabbed their children and people started running in every direction while security guards tried desperately to maintain order. He told us the substance appeared to be a powerful hallucinogenic compound mixed into several base ingredients used by multiple vendors, with confirmed cases from the funnel cake stand, the lemonade booth, the barbecue pit, and at least 7 other vendors. My mouth went dry as I looked at the half-eaten pretzel in my hand, trying to remember if I'd started feeling strange or if it was just fear making my heart race. The symptoms would start with mild visual distortions, followed by severe disorientation, elevated heart rate, and potential seizures, he explained, and anyone who had eaten anything needed immediate medical evaluation, even though there were only 50 ambulances en route for potentially thousands of victims. Through the chaos, I could already see some people stumbling and grabbing onto tent poles for support, while others sat down hard on the ground holding their heads. I need to be completely honest with you all because you deserve the truth. This was not an accident. Someone deliberately poisoned our food supply in what appears to be the largest mass poisoning event in state history. A woman near the Ferris wheel started screaming that the lights were melting while her husband tried to hold her still. The person responsible was Janet Morrison, who had worked as the food safety coordinator for the past 12 years and was arrested 20 minutes ago attempting to leave the fairgrounds with detailed notes about her plan, apparently believing she was exposing the toxic food industrial complex by forcing thousands of people to experience what she called chemical enlightenment. The elderly man who'd been selling candy apples since I was a kid was now on his knees vomiting while teenagers filmed everything on their phones. We learned that Morrison had spent months planning this attack, specifically choosing a compound that would affect different people at different rates based on body weight and metabolism, timing it for the busiest day, knowing there would be over 30,000 potential victims, and now emergency responders were overwhelmed. My vision started to blur, and I couldn't tell if it was tears or the beginning of whatever was coursing through my system. The compound she used was similar to LSD, but potentially more dangerous because of the dosage uncertainty, meaning some people may have ingested massive amounts while others got trace exposure, and we wouldn't know the full extent until symptoms manifested. A father carrying his unconscious daughter pushed past me toward the medical tents while her mother stumbled behind them speaking in tongues. The director promised to stay on the microphone as long as possible to help guide us through the crisis, explaining that psychoactive effects could last anywhere from 8 to 48 hours depending on exposure level, and while medical tents had sedatives and monitoring equipment, they simply didn't have enough resources for everyone. The Ferris wheel operator had abandoned his post, and people were trapped at the top screaming about dragons in the sky, while below them the House of Mirrors had become a nightmare scene of people lost in their own reflections. Those who hadn't consumed anything were asked to help keep affected individuals safe from harm, preventing them from wandering into traffic or dangerous areas, since the compound could cause extreme paranoia and hallucinations that would seem completely real to those experiencing them. By now, the entire fairground looked like a scene from a disaster movie with thousands of people in various states of distress, while sirens wailed from every direction and helicopters circled overhead. The fair director's voice crackled through the speakers again, but this time it sounded different, like he was speaking underwater. I blinked hard, trying to focus on my sister who was swaying slightly beside me, her face pale and eyes wide. Around us, the chaos intensified as more people began showing symptoms, some laughing uncontrollably while others cowered from invisible threats. I grabbed my sister's arm to steady her, but my hand felt like it was moving through molasses. The pretzel I'd dropped lay on the ground, and for a moment it seemed to writhe like a snake before I shook my head to clear the image. My sister mumbled something about the clouds turning purple, and I realized she'd eaten more of her corn dog than I'd had of my pretzel. A security guard rushed past us toward the medical tents, and I overheard him shouting into his radio that Morrison had never made it to the police car, that she'd somehow slipped away during the initial panic. My blood ran cold, or maybe it was burning. I couldn't tell anymore as the sensations in my body began to blur together. The announcement about her arrest had been premature, and she was still somewhere on the fairgrounds. I tried to flag down another security guard to warn them, but when I opened my mouth, the words came out jumbled and slow. The guard looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear before hurrying away, clearly thinking I was just another victim of the poisoning. My sister giggled at something only she could see, and I tightened my grip on her arm, determined to get her to safety even as the ground beneath my feet seemed to ripple. The medical tents were overflowing with people, and I could see EMTs turning away those with milder symptoms to focus on the severe cases. A woman was being strapped to a gurney, her body convulsing, while nearby a teenage boy sat rocking back and forth, tears streaming down his face as he whispered about spiders crawling under his skin. I steered my sister away from the worst of it, knowing we'd have to ride this out on our own. That's when I saw her. Janet Morrison was moving through the crowd near the games area, wearing a maintenance worker's uniform she must have stolen. Even through my increasingly distorted vision, I recognized her from the employee photos posted at the fair entrance every year. She was watching the chaos with an expression of satisfaction action, occasionally stopping to observe specific victims like she was conducting some twisted experiment. I tried to point her out to a passing police officer, but my arm moved in slow motion, and by the time I managed to gesture, she had melted back into the crowd. The officer barely glanced in my direction before rushing towards someone who had climbed onto the carousel and was trying to ride a painted horse that they believed was real. My sister tugged at my sleeve, insisting we needed to find the purple clouds before they disappeared. Morrison appeared again near the cotton candy stand, this time carrying a clipboard and pretending to take notes like she was part of the emergency response team. She approached a family huddled together on a bench, the parents trying to comfort their young children who were all showing different levels of symptoms. I watched in horror as she knelt beside them, speaking softly, probably telling them lies about where to find help or what to do. My legs felt like jelly as I tried to move toward them, to warn them, but the distance seemed to stretch impossibly far. Colors were starting to bleed together at the edges of my vision, and I had to stop and lean against a fence post to keep from falling. My sister had gone quiet beside me, her eyes unfocused as she stared at her own hands like she'd never seen them before. A man in a red shirt, who seemed less affected than most, noticed my distress and came over to help. He said his name was Theodore, that he'd only had a sip of lemonade before the announcement came through. I managed to communicate about Morrison through broken sentences and frantic gestures, and his eyes widened with understanding. He'd seen her too, had wondered why she was still walking around if she'd been arrested. Theodore agreed to help me keep track of Morrison while making sure my sister didn't wander off. The three of us moved slowly through the fairgrounds, which had transformed into a surreal nightmare landscape. The funhouse music still played from some attractions, mixing with sirens and screams to create a hellish symphony. Every few steps I had to stop and remind myself what was real and what was the substance playing tricks on my mind. Morrison had moved to the food court area, where she stood observing the abandoned stalls with their contaminated supplies. She pulled out a small notebook and began writing, occasionally glancing around to make sure no one was watching her too closely. The security presence had thinned as guards dealt with more immediate crises, leaving her free to move about. I watched her pick up a half-eaten funnel cake from a table, examining it like a scientist studying a specimen. The powdered sugar seemed to glow in my altered vision, pulsing with an unnatural light. I wonder what Janet Morrison's really up to here, watching everyone suffer while she takes notes like some kind of twisted scientist. Something feels off about how easily she slipped away from arrest and got that uniform so fast. Theodore whispered that we should try to get closer, to hear what she might be saying to herself, but my sister chose that moment to break free from my grip and start walking toward the Midway Games. The next few minutes blurred together as Theodore and I struggled to corral my sister while keeping Morrison in sight. She kept insisting she needed to win a stuffed animal that was calling her name, and it took both of us to guide her away from the abandoned game booths. By the time we looked back, Morrison had vanished again. The panic around us intensified as more fairgoers succumbed to the poison's effects. Theodore scanned the crowd while I held my sister's wrist tightly, her skin feeling unnaturally cold against my palm. She kept reaching for invisible butterflies, and I had to physically redirect her every few seconds to keep her from wandering into the chaos. Morrison reappeared near the livestock barn, this time wearing a different shirt and carrying a first aid kit. She moved with purpose, approaching groups of affected people and offering what looked like assistance. My stomach churned as I watched her hand out small white pills from the kit, telling people they were antidotes. The victims eagerly swallowed them, desperate for any relief. Theodore and I exchanged horrified glances. Whatever she was distributing couldn't be legitimate medicine. I tried to move faster toward her, but my legs felt disconnected from my body, each step requiring enormous concentration. The ground beneath me seemed to tilt and sway like a ship's deck in a storm. A woman who'd taken Morrison's pills suddenly collapsed, her body going rigid. Morrison simply made a note on her clipboard and moved to the next group. The calculating coldness of her actions cut through my substance-addled haze, filling me with a rage that helped me focus. My sister suddenly pulled hard against my grip, nearly breaking free. She'd spotted a snow cone stand and was convinced the ice was made of diamonds. Theodore helped me guide her to a relatively quiet spot near the petting zoo fence, where we could regroup without losing sight of Morrison. The animals in the petting zoo were agitated, sensing the chaos around them. Goats bleated frantically while rabbits huddled in corners of their pens. Even through my altered perception, I could see their fear was real, not a hallucination. My sister reached through the fence, trying to pet a goat that seemed to shimmer with rainbow colors in her vision. Morrison had now positioned herself near the main entrance, where new arrivals were still coming in, unaware of the contamination. She was turning them away, playing the role of a concerned official, but I noticed she was selective about who she warned. Families with young children were sent away, but teenagers and young adults were allowed through with no warning. Theodore pointed out that she seemed to be documenting reactions, taking special interest in how different age groups responded to the poison. She had a system, a method to her madness that went beyond simple chaos. This wasn't just about exposing people to chemicals. She was conducting a massive, unauthorized experiment on human subjects. My vision swam as I tried to process this realization. The edges of my sight pulsed with colors that shouldn't exist, and I had to close my eyes briefly to regain some equilibrium. When I opened them, my sister had managed to grab hold of a rabbit through the fence and was trying to pull it out, convinced it was made of cotton candy. Theodore helped me gently pry her fingers loose while I kept watching Morrison. She'd moved again, this time to the grandstand area where the evening's concert was supposed to happen. The stage lights were still on, creating a bizarre light show that seemed to mesmerize the affected crowd members who gravitated toward it like moths to flame. Morrison climbed onto the stage and began adjusting the lighting controls. The strobing patterns she created seemed designed to intensify the hallucinogenic effects, and I watched in horror as people in the crowd began seizing or dropping to their knees, overwhelmed by the sensory assault. I had to stop her, but my body wasn't cooperating. Each movement felt like swimming through thick syrup, and my depth perception was completely shot. Theodore suggested we try to find help, but looking around, I realized there was no one left to help us. The security guards were overwhelmed, the medical personnel were swamped, and the police were focused on crowd control at the exits. My sister had gone quiet, which worried me more than her earlier agitation. Her pupils were dilated so wide her eyes looked black, and she was staring at her hands as if they held the the secrets of the universe. I shook her gently, trying to keep her grounded in reality, but she didn't respond. Morrison descended from the stage and began moving through the crowd again. This time, she was collecting items from victims: phones, wallets, personal belongings. At first, I thought she was robbing them, but then I saw her carefully labeling each item with a number that corresponded to notes in her book. She was cataloging her test subjects. The fury that built in my chest helped cut through some of the substance's effects. This woman had poisoned thousands of people, including my sister, and was now treating us like lab rats. Theodore felt it too. I could see his jaw clenching as he watched her work. We needed a plan, but thinking clearly was nearly impossible. The hallucinations were getting stronger, not weaker. The fence posts around the petting zoo looked like they were melting, and the sounds of the fair had become a cacophony of distorted noise that made my head throb. Morrison approached a group of teenagers who were sitting in a circle, holding hands and laughing at shared visions. She knelt beside them, pretending to check their vitals while actually placing something in the center of their circle. After she left, one of the teens picked up what she'd left, another vial of Hills. Theodore and I watched as they passed the vial around, each taking one. Within minutes, their laughter turned to screams. One boy began clawing at his skin while a girl ran full speed into a tent hole, knocking herself unconscious. Morrison observed from a distance, making notes. My sister suddenly spoke, her voice dreamy and disconnected. She said the rabbits were telling her secrets about Morrison, that they knew why she was doing this. I would have dismissed it as hallucination, but Theodore leaned in, interested. In our altered state, even the impossible seemed worth considering. According to my sister's rabbit conversation, Morrison had lost someone to food poisoning years ago. The rabbits knew because they'd seen her crying by their pen during last year's fair. The story was probably just my sister's substance-addled mind creating narratives, but it made a twisted kind of sense. Morrison's position as food safety coordinator would have given her both access and motivation. A commotion near the carnival rides drew our attention. Morrison was there, but this time she wasn't alone. A man in a maintenance uniform was with her, helping her distribute more of her fake antidotes. My heart sank as I realized she had accomplices, people who were helping her conduct this massive experiment. Theodore recognized the man as someone who'd been working the ring toss game earlier. He must have been in on the plan from the beginning, strategically positioned to observe and assist. The scope of Morrison's planning became clearer. This wasn't a solo act of madness, but a coordinated attack. My sister tried to stand, saying she needed to tell the rabbit something important. Her legs gave out immediately, and she collapsed against me. Her skin was burning hot now, a stark contrast to the earlier coldness. The symptoms were evolving, and I had no idea if that was normal or if she'd gotten a particularly bad dose. Morrison and her accomplice split up, each taking a different section of the fairgrounds. She headed toward the arts and crafts building while he went to the 4-H barn. Theodore and I had a quick, slurred discussion about whether to follow her or try to get my sister to medical attention. The medical tents were still overwhelmed, with people being turned away unless they were actively seizing or unconscious. My sister, despite her condition, was still responsive and mobile. We decided to keep tracking Morrison while monitoring my sister's symptoms. The arts and crafts building was a maze of displays and booths, now made even more confusing by the visual distortions. Quilts on the walls seemed to breathe and pulse, their patterns shifting and swirling. Morrison moved through the aisles with purpose, stopping at specific booths to leave more of her pills. I noticed she was targeting the water stations, dropping tablets into the cups of water that volunteers had set out for people suffering from the heat. Anyone seeking relief would unknowingly dose themselves further. The calculated cruelty of it made my hands shake with anger. Theodore spotted a security radio someone had dropped. He grabbed it, trying to call for help, but the channels were chaos, overlapping voices reporting emergencies throughout the fairgrounds. When he tried to report Morrison's location, no one responded. We were on our own. My sister began humming a tune I didn't recognize, swaying slightly as she did. The melody seemed to help her focus, and she was able to walk more steadily. I kept one arm around her waist while Theodore led the way, following Morrison's path through the building. She exited through a side door that led to the animal barn area. The smell hit us immediately, a mixture of hay, manure, and something chemical that made my altered senses real. Inside, Morrison was opening animal pens, releasing confused and frightened livestock into the aisles. The chaos she created served as cover for her real purpose. While everyone scrambled to contain the animals, she accessed a storage room marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Through the doorway, I glimpsed shelves of chemicals and equipment, supplies for maintaining the animal areas that could potentially be used to create more of her poison. Theodore tried to get closer, but a massive pig